Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first webinar for Strategic Farm Week. Absolutely fantastic to have you all here and to join us. Been a great week so far. I've had all the videos yesterday and looking forward to the rest of the week. This morning you're joining us for our first webinar. The idea of these webinars is to bring to life the work on the strategic farms and to give you some of the how-to lessons that are coming out of the strategic farms. The first one this morning is looking at how to monitor crop development and disease, and I'm really pleased to welcome my co-hosts this morning, Brian Barker from EJ Barker and Sons and Catherine Harries from AHDB. And Brian, Catherine and myself are going to be talking you through this session this morning. So just as we start, just a few housekeeping rules before we start. You're all on mute this morning, but please feel free to use the questions box that's on your grey panel on the side. If you've got any questions, whatever they are, let us know. Myself and my colleague Christian are going to be sitting in the background looking at those, taking any answers, and we'll share any questions to the rest of the group as well, where relevant. Please do ask questions as we go through. Those record it, and then we'll pick those up as we go through the session and ask them at appropriate times as we go through. We're scheduled to be here till 10:30 today. The idea with that is to give us plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. I'll talk you through the format of the session in a minute, but yeah, feel free to do that. The other thing is that this webinar is being recorded, and so the recording of this webinar will be available on YouTube afterwards, and you'll get a link to it in the email at the end of the morning. Everything that's happening this week is happening. You've hopefully got emails, and AHDB serials and hashtag strategic farm is the introduction to what's happening, what's already happened this week, and we'll keep that updated with content. Equally, everything from this week is on ahdb.org.uk/SF Week 2020. There are BASIS and NROSO points that are eligible for this morning. BASIS, there are 2 points that have been awarded for this. If you'd like to receive BASIS points, please put your name, your BASIS account number and your postcode in the questions box, and we'll record those and your points will be awarded. NROSO, we're very much hoping that we've got points. We've sent it off and allocated for them. So equally, if you're a NROSO sprayer operator, please put your name, your NROSO member number, your date of birth and your postcode in the questions box, and we'll record those for you as well. So the way the session is going to work this morning, we're going to have a couple of introductory questions in a minute for you, and then Brian's going to kick us off first, looking at how to monitor crop development and his experiences so far. Catherine's then going to take over after that for a session on disease scoring and looking at the work that is happening on the strategic farms and happens elsewhere with our recommended lists as well. We've then got plenty of time for questions and conversation, and I'll finish it off at the end of the morning. I'm Teresa Meadows. I'm the Knowledge Exchange Manager covering East Anglia and running the strategic farm with Brian, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this session this morning. So really the main outcome we're hoping at the end of this morning is that you know how to disease score your crops and how to assess crop development through the season, and potentially use that to match inputs to your potential as you go through the season and looking at your yield and yield potential. But is there anything else that you'd like to know or to get out of it? And perhaps if there is, you'd put the question in the question box as to if there's anything specific that you'd like to know, and then we can pick up on those as we go through and make sure that those questions are answered. Whatever that is, we'd be pleased to know, and then can tailor this session to what you'd like as well. So just to start us off and to get you using the questions and the polls, we've got a quick poll that's going to pop up in a minute to ask you, have you ever been out and plant counted or tiller, shoot, ear counted your crop, or tried disease scoring before? Have you done both maybe, or have you never tried anything? So in a minute, Christian's going to launch this poll for you and we'll see what you've done. Please, Christian. Okay, so it's changing as we go through. Just collecting your responses. You can all vote on the side. And just while we're doing that, along the side as well, you'll see there's a handouts button, and on the handouts you can download the handouts that are relevant to this. If you just have a look, you will need the disease one that's at the top for Catherine's session a bit later on. Okay, so Christian, would you like to display the responses? So we've got 21% of you that have had a go at counting your plants before, 17% of you that have done disease scoring, 28% of you that have done both, and 34% of you that haven't done anything. Great, so a real mixture of people with different experiences, and I'm sure different questions for those of you that have done it already, and for those that you haven't done either, hopefully you'll be able to pick it up as we go through. So that's that for me. Welcome to this morning, and I'm going to hand over now to Brian Barker, who's going to talk you through how to monitor crop development. Over to you, Brian.
Hello, good morning everyone, and welcome to the webinar. We have basically been trying to work out what to do this week, and with obviously the lockdown restrictions, so it's all been brought to you virtually, and there's loads going on this week, as Teresa said. But I've been given the sort of kicking off point to talk about how I monitor my crops, and Teresa's going to be pressing the buttons, so there might be a few sort of glitches along the way, but we're going to try and be as professional and smooth as possible. So why did we start doing this on our farm? So about 4 years ago, I had a cruciate ligament operation on my knee, which meant that I couldn't do any crop walking, and it was on a farm walk, and we were actually standing in our yen plot, and someone said, well, what do you think this is actually going to yield? And I then stood up and thought, actually, I don't really know what it's actually going to yield. I said, well, I'm hoping for over 10 tonne, and that word hope was where this quote came from. And then we don't want to be farming to hope. We want to have much more information about what we have got in our fields and what we can actually do to manipulate that growth, as well as keeping a record of how the crop's developing, because the seasons that we're getting in the moment, like the seasons that we got now, we haven't had any rain for what, 6 weeks, and crops are pretty much wilting over at the moment. So how can we sort of keep a record of how our crops are developing with the weather in the season? So if Teresa keeps moving me on, we should be able to sort of give you a thought of my process. So this is basically my mindset. I'm letting you into sort of my mind on how to crop monitor. And the reasons I did it was it gave me a routine to get out to every single field. My aim was to do every single field and benchmark them against each other, so I could see which crops were performing, which varieties, which soil type, drill dates, all these sort of things could show little insights into what was performing, what wasn't. Was there something I did with cultivations or something like that? So it gave me a routine to go to every single field, and it made me actually get down and get into the crop. I'm sure there's plenty of drive-by agronomists, not agronomists, drive-by crop walkers who just basically get to the gateway, have a look, walk out, oh, that's great. But actually to go out, get into the field, get onto your hands and knees. I ended up having to buy a pair of knee pads because I was spending so much time down on the crops. And when you get a flint pushing into a brand new knee that I had reconstructed, it wasn't sort of ideal. And we made a quadrant up and basically got to it. And we then sort of learned over a couple of years. I've been doing this for what, 4 years now, and sort of learned how I could then sort of use the information that I was getting to actually adapt my investment of inputs. And it's been really interesting, and it's sort of given me, along with the weather data we're now taking from the weather station, I can then look back at how crops in certain scenarios, when we had the last dry spell in 2019, I can look back to there and see how the crops are doing. So I can then benchmark not just within season, but also years as well. So it's given me a whole load of data. It's also given me a chance to really get my spreadsheets up to speed. And so these next slides are going to be sort of taking you through last year and how the crops developed and what we saw. So hopefully my slide clicker will click on forward. this is it. So this, we basically had a measuring stick. So this is how I do it. So basically, just it's a very simple scenario of maths. So coulters going up and down the field. Have a measuring stick, either 50 centimeters, 35 centimeters, depending on how long you want to take. Just simply counting up either shoots, plants, tillers, all the way up that, doing it multiple times across the field. If you've got your fields all zoned for variable seed rates, then you've already got places to go to. So you then go to each zone, do 3 or 4 in each zone, and move around the field. So it's basically really knowing what's going on and then multiplying it up. So this publication from the AHDB, the Wheat Growth Guide, has got a great benchmark crop in it where they've actually used it. So at different times of the season, they sort of recommend what you need for 11-ton crop. So the Growth Guide for me was another key part of this. And that's a great publication. I think on the right-hand side in your webinar control box, there's a whole load of handouts, and there's a link to the Growth Guide if you haven't seen that or you want to download it. But that's a very basic calculation. It's all about maths. Basically, every time through the season, you're taking out another assumption. So 300 plants will have 50 grain sites with 1,000 grain weight of 50, all this sort of stuff. There's assumptions all the way through it, but every time I've done a count, I'm removing one of those assumptions. And so then my actual estimated yield gets more accurate as we go through. So this is what I'm going to show you, hopefully, if I remember which slide is coming next. So yeah, so this is the Growth Guide information. So this is the benchmarked crop. So in the Growth Guide, the 11-ton crop is said to have 350 plants, which is aiming for an overwinter survival of about 260 plants. And then through the season, at different times, based around the main input timings, you can see that I've separated all the information out. But again, there's loads more information in the Growth Guide. And again, this is all sort of very simple stuff that any farmer can get out. You know how to identify a plant, you know how to sort of look at and see the shoots developing, just simply counting them. And then as the tillers become more obvious, you can then do major and minor tillers. That's what I've developed mine into. And then as ears emerge, and then at the very end, the real one that I don't look forward to is the actual grain per ear, when you actually have to break all the ears down and count how many grain sites we got. But the most important one for me is when I actually then took the 1,000 grain weight off the combine, because that's the final assumption, which then changes all the information to being accurate for that season. So you really get a real detailed information on how much estimated yield we've got. So in the planning stage, this is an insight into my spreadsheet, hopefully coming along. So in Excel, I've sort of created my own spreadsheet. So not many people get to see this. There's probably a few columns and a few calculations which don't sort of look right. I'll sort of play around with it and adapt it for accurate information going into it. But it's a general feel of what I've done. I've only picked 5 fields from the 2019 harvest. And so from this, we can then follow these through all the counts which I did last year and see how closely we get. So in the planning stage, we're looking at 300 plants, the 1,000 grain weight of what's going into, well, that's the 1,000 grain off the combine because this was done last year, but that would have been at drilling. So for the start, I would have used the 1,000 grain weight, which was being planted. And then I've changed that for the actual that's come off the combine to make things so much more accurate. Estimated field loss, this is from previous seasons. So over the last sort of 3 years before this, I had been looking at establishment losses at for each drill. Obviously, I'm using 3 different drills, so and they all have different losses at establishment. So my DTS over the last 3 years in the similar conditions were finding a 22% loss at establishment, whereas my DD was having, I think it was 18, and the combination was having sort of about 20. So there was different things, so I can adapt it for what I'm planning, so I can get a much more accurate calculation for seed rates and seed sown. And then if we're placing any fertilizers, also highlighted on there. So it's a really good place to put information about what's going on to sort of each field. So the first count I would have done was establishment, but I'll just highlight the two columns on the left of the screen. So the blue column is the actual weight of the combine that was recorded, adjusted to 15% moisture. So these are what actually came off the combine. So this is what we're going to be judging against. The estimated yield at 15% is the average of all the estimates of this calculator. So as we go through, I take the average of the planning, and then every time I do a count, that creates an average. And so that column will change, and you'll see that there's some correlations as we go through. So at the moment, starting off, it was actually quite accurate. And we'll then see as it goes through each count timing, you'll see those numbers change, apart from the blue column will stay the same. But with the establishment, we've got some fields did better than others. So we did, like, say, take Green Farm. It established 118%. So that's much kinder land. So I probably overestimated the field loss. So that's something that I had a note for next year, that I could actually rein back a little bit on my seed if I wanted to in those better ground conditions, instead of taking an average for just the establishment. But then you take Wiverston Road, which may have been done at a different time, or a different date, or a different soil type, actually didn't do as well, and we only established 270 plants per square meter. So the yellow column on the right actually shows the estimated yield at establishment was actually lower, and the better ones were actually experiencing a better estimated yield than 11 tons. So we can see that's already showing an indication of the importance of getting a crop up and away, and getting these calculations right at the start. So as we move through the season, through winter, nothing much goes on, and just keeping tabs on what's going on. But the other thing, that when we're doing counts, you're also looking at early disease, weeds, blackgrass, broadleaf weeds. So you can sort of start building up a real good data set and records of what's going on. So construction phase in the wheat growth guide is up to the 8th of April. This is when your crop is basically trying to put on as many shoots as possible, and you need sun, you need water, and you need a bit of warmth just to get everything going. And so I actually did 2 that year. So post winter was when it basically came out of winter. This was to see how many plants we had lost. This is actually probably the most hardest count that I did, because it was just a thatch of shoots. A bit different to what we've experienced this year, but it was so hard to actually get them that you're sort of sifting through a sea of leaf and shoots, and it's quite hard to sort of get a feel of it. In the growth guide, the 8th of April is the key timing, and this is where it's saying that we should have around 1,000 shoots per square meter. And you can see that actually I was quite below that for pretty much all of them, and some had sort of done better than others. Triangle field was lower. But again, the yield then sort of reflected that in the calculation. So all the assumptions that the growth guide take forward, when I was actually 200 shoots less than the actual growth guide, it was showing that my yield had actually dipped. So that was sort of looking at changing the idea. So then you're sort of looking at how you could manipulate shoot survival into tillers, and so we were looking at micronutrition or biostimulants to make sure that the plants were actually basically holding on to the shoots that they have developed through the season. It all changes with weather conditions. So if we I can't remember what we had last year. We had a very dry April. So this was actually probably the time when we were sort of looking at sort of possibly sort of a dry period. So it was quite interesting to see these sort of effects carrying out. So as we then moved on, this is when we sort of came into probably the 8th of April, probably around T0, and then we'll be coming probably into sort of the T1 timings. I tried to keep it sort of regimented around the timings that we would be going out with the sprayer. So this is when I'll be actually making the decisions for what inputs that I'll be looking at. And you can see that again on the blue column, you can see that there's actually quite a close correlation between the actual yield and what we're estimating. So it shows that there is worth in doing it, because at T1, when you're actually working out what you should be investing, well, if we can get some really accurate findings then, but when you actually look at the actual estimated yields, again, the shoots and tiller counts, it was still giving you a variance of below what it actually did. And so you can't actually go by that single timing of count. You need to take the average approach, and this is what sort of I've seen over the last 4 years. And we've got some really close correlations between what we've taken off and then the final average of all the counts and results we've done. And so you can start looking at how many shoots per plant, and you start going into the sort of the real detail. So along this 50 centimeter run, we were getting 120 shoots or sort of developing tillers, and then multiplying that up with a calculation was quite good. So my row widths are 33 centimeters. So with the DTS, it's a band. It's a bit easier if you've got a disc coulter or a single tine coulter, because you can actually a bit easier to count. But mine's a band on 33 for this one. So it's quite it's just adapting to the drills and the systems that you've got. And then you can play around with all the stats and make stats look what you want. And so then as we moved into the ear counts, again, on the sort of left-hand side, you can see that they're sort of the averages are sort of below most of them, but they're not far off when you actually look. And so this is the one where I started splitting in the last couple of years. I started splitting into major and minor shoots. It's very easy when you're going through and counting up your line. You can start getting a feel of main tillers and secondary tillers, and you can start feeling. And so they're sort of looking at different variety traits as well. When we're looking at, we're obviously in a regenerative ag sort of one pass system wherever possible. So I was looking for varieties which produced big major tillers, which branched out, and we're on wide rows, so we're on 33 centimeter bands or 20 centimeters mainly. And so we wanted crops which showed real good biomass growth for their shoots and tillers. And so we sort of separated major and minor shoots going forward. So that was what's going on. I've just seen that my question box is flagging up, but I'll come back to that. Well, we're nearly at the end for the questions. So yeah, so and then ear counts. This was probably coincide with just around T3 timing, and you can see that the actual estimated yield is the lowest it's ever been, which is quite interesting. And I don't really know why the ear counts come, but it must be something in the calculation. I think this is where the grain counting and the 1,000 grain weights will in the actual growth guide change it, but this is the lowest time, so it's sort of, don't get disheartened if it sort of came to that, but when you're actually averaging it out through the season, I think this is where the sort of the good information comes from it. So then the painstaking one of when you're just before harvest, as grains are pretty much developed, go and select a whole series of ears from the field and break them down, counting how many form grains you have. This is quite interesting also when you're looking at where the actual developing grains had sort of stopped. Some were short at the bottom, some were short at the tip, and so then I was making notes for different varieties of which ones had produced better grains. So just adding to that information that I was sort of gaining through the season. And when you start putting in the actual 1,000 grain weight off the combine again, so when we're looking at the estimated yields at the end, so that's the circle highlights the importance of the 1,000 grain weight, because that is the final assumption that in the growth guide it assumes that the 1,000 grain weight off the combine is, I think it was 50, whereas in certain seasons you don't get 50, and so by putting that actual 1,000 grain weight off the combine, not taking any cleaning any seed off, it's just literally what comes off the combine, putting that in and changing the actual all the calculations brings everything in line to exactly what we've estimated and what we've actually got off the field. And as you can see on the sort of left hand side, we were very, very close for what we've estimated. And so during harvest, I could actually go and get the fields which had the highest yield, which I was looking at, and I knew pretty much what I was walking into. It would help for storage. If you're using floors and you knew what tonnage you need to have on each floor. So for me, it just gave me so much more information about how the crop was developing through the season. And over the last sort of 4 years of doing it, I'm getting more accurate. I think I was over my whole wheat crop, I was sort of 2% estimated to actual, which for me was just getting out and my time spent a bit of playing around with Excel and sort of honing my skills in this. And it's really benefited because it's now sort of allowed me to adapt my sort of method of getting the crops invested into. So this is how I then use this information. So if we click on to the next screen. Yeah, so this is my whole wheat crop for 2019. So I break them down into the good, the average, and the poor ranking. And I basically then adapt the inputs to what I see happening in the field and what weather conditions are going on. So if you're looking at coming into a wet period and you think the disease is going to sort of run rife, then you can then adjust it, and you know how much you can sort of put against the investment of the different categories, looking after the best or holding the best back, or trying to increase the poorer ones with micronutrition, biostimulants if it's early on, trying to bump them up, or do you then start reining them back? And obviously tonight in another webinar that we're talking about how to lower inputs, and this is sort of what we've done on our farm, and I'll be discussing that later on tonight. So I then rank them, and you can see that the ranks change through the season. So you can see that different fields fluctuate through the season, which is also you also get the ones which start off bad and never get any further than being bad. So West Farm at the bottom was ranked 17th for pretty much all the way through the season, and it's sort of never got any further. That was due to poor establishment at the start. So, but the range is from 12.2 to 7.6. So that's a 4.6 ton average, ton range. Divide that into 3 and then split it down into your categories, and that's how the categories stay for how I then adapt my sort of yield for my investments going forward. So for me, it's been a really interesting way of sort of doing it, and it's sort of given me a lot of confidence into how I then invest into my crops, because I know that I can sort of predict and hopefully get as close to the yields as possible. So I know how to budget, I know how to know when I've spent too much and when I need to sort of start reining things back in. So for me, it's been a very good sort of method and change in farming sort of system to go forward to. And then with the strategic farm, we then sort of put my traffic light system to the test, and we did this field trial, which was where we had untreated and then treated 5 varieties with what I had done to my red category, to my amber category, and to my green category. So in that season, had I spent too much? It was basically a test of my approach, and it showed up some really interesting results last year at the results meeting, which can be found online on the AHDB website. But also we've repeated it this year as well. So we're building up that information about how we can sort of adapt our investments and input to the actual crop development in the field. So that's pretty much me. I'm hoping that someone's going to jump in and ask me a few questions, because I'm trying to read what's coming along, and hopefully Teresa will pop back up and sort of stop me in my tracks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. A lot covered there, and a lot of detail, and a lot of time spent on your spreadsheets and out on the field. So we have got a couple of questions, well, a few questions coming in now that I think we'll take a few, and then we can always come back to some more later on if other people have got them. So The first question from Tom Dewars is, by the 8th of April count, did you make a decision to rein back inputs on Triangle Field as it was showing less potential?
I would have been using when I split them down into 3. So Triangle Field may have actually, when you looked at the rest of the actual crop, it may have actually been still in the green category. So I wasn't too worried about that, but you start finding that the real poor crops get to the bottom quite quickly, and those are the ones which you can then really identify and say early season. I try and say, well, actually, how can I stimulate more growth? And so either through biostimulants or trace elements or fertilizer applications, you can start to manipulate them in the early season. So I wouldn't be reining straight away because they were showing a decrease. It's then as we get further down the line, you start looking at the scenarios of the long range forecast. That's when you start going, actually, can I pull back a little bit? Is it actually going to get to 10 ton, 9 ton, 8 ton? And so you start then adapting your inputs to much more in-field, and your farmer gut instinct comes into it, saying, well, actually, if I know that it's not really going to be honest, the hope of 10 ton has now vanished into the distance. I need to sort of start thinking about how to make a profitable 8 ton crop, and then fertilizer applications get reined back. Then you're sort of pulling it back each time to then sort of adapt. So hopefully your cost of production doesn't run away with you, thinking that you're trying to buy back the yield. And that's what we're trying to stop doing, is just keep throwing more at it. And it's knowing when to turn the tap of inputs off to make sure that you're actually getting a profit from every single field of wheat.
Definitely. So related to that slightly, Matthew Kenny's got an interesting question here about, do you monitor spraying efficacy? And if so, how?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate to have a brilliant spray operator, Nick, who's been heavily involved with the application club with Syngenta, and he's very vocal about spreading his knowledge of application out there. So the application side is left to Nick. So our system of decision making is that I do the sort of the money side. Toby, my agronomist, does the actual chemistry side, and then Nick does the application side. So I don't sort of look at the sort of efficiency of the application side. Nick sort of covers that off and does that very well. But when you're out and about and you're looking into the crop, this is when the disease scoring comes into it. So it's just having that regular approach into the field. And I haven't really done disease scoring until this recent season, when I've been actually trying to learn it, because this is a skill that I think that with all the trials that we're doing, it's really interesting to know. So Catherine's obviously going to be following up about the disease scoring. So this is another part when you're out in the field and you get into that routine of going to the field, seeing what disease is happening, what broadleaf weeds, and the efficiency of your application. You can actually get a really good understanding, and then you look back at the records, wind, sun, rainfall after application, and you can start building up some really interesting, good data that you can then sort of adapt your farming systems to for future years.
Brilliant. I think that's a nice segue into Catherine's. We've got some really good other questions here, which I'll share with you all and keep asking them as we go through, and then we can pick up on them once Catherine's spoken. But as you've done a good segue into Catherine, I think we'll keep going for now, and then we'll come back in a minute. Thank you, Brian. So over to you, Catherine, to talk us through disease scoring.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Catherine Harries, and I manage cereals and oilseeds disease research at AHDB. So the two main things I do are analyse the disease data for the recommended list disease ratings, and then also the fungicide performance efficacy curves. So today I'm going to take you through how you can do your own disease assessments and use them to inform crop management. So we'll go through why you want to disease score, a bit of disease ID, and how to disease score. And we'll just be focusing on wheat today. So firstly, I just want to think, what do we mean by disease scoring? So go out into the crop, you're parting it and seeing what disease is there in different fields, different varieties, and throughout the season to build up a picture of disease levels on your farm and in your different disease management systems. So why do we want to bother to do this? Well, it's important to monitor the success or otherwise of your disease management strategy. So if you're getting high levels of disease with or without a fungicide, then this suggests you need to look at another aspect of your crop management. So that might be rotation or drilling date or variety. You can use the disease information in combination with the weather and weather forecasts to inform fungicide programs throughout the season. So although most fungicides are protectant, so they're only applying before we see any disease, we can still alter rates and products by assessing disease levels. And your agronomist will be doing this anyway, but the more information you both have to make the decision, the better a decision will be made. And then finally, if you're home saving seed, it's important to monitor any seed-borne diseases that you see after flowering. Okay, thanks, Teresa. So it's very important to leave an untreated area in each field that you'll be disease assessing. So you probably have untreated areas around gateways or under trees, but it's important that your untreated area is representative of the rest of the crop. So it's better if you do it in the middle of the field. You can put a cane in the tram line and leave an area unsprayed with fungicides between the two canes, and just make sure that any sprayer operators know not to spray fungicides on that section. And to make it most useful, you need to have an untreated area in each field that you're assessing. Okay, next slide, Teresa. So when should you monitor your crops? So it's important to look at the crop regularly throughout the season so you can build up a good picture of what you're seeing and note any unexpected things. But it should be done at least before each spray timing and then also at the end of the season. So you go out over the winter, see how much disease is on the older leaves, and this is a disease that will eventually splash up to infect the rest of the crop, especially for diseases like Septoria. So before T0, you'll be wanting to check for any yellow rust. Sorry, still the last slide. So trials have shown that there's no yield benefit from controlling Septoria at T0. It's only beneficial in the event of a weather-delayed T1. So the T0 timing is only targeting rusts which need treating in a high-risk situation, so for example a susceptible variety, or if you can see active rust there. And we'll be talking more about yellow and brown rust disease ratings and also the changes in the pathogen population we've been seeing recently at the recommended list webinar on the 24th of June. So please do call in for that. Next slide, please. So then at T1, you'll again be checking for yellow rust and looking for Septoria at the bottom of the canopy. Next slide, please. And then before the flag leaf spray is the time to start doing a proper comparison between your treated and untreated areas to assess the effectiveness of previous sprays and get an idea of disease pressure to inform your T2. So for example, this year there's not been much Septoria at the bottom of the canopy. It's been dry and forecast to be dry, so you could have made the decision to cut back on your T2. But if you see rust at before the T2 timing, it's important to still control them. Bear in mind that if it turns wet, then fusarium can be a real threat, so be prepared to apply a robust T3 if necessary. So then later in the season, after T3, you're monitoring the crop again for foliar disease and comparing the treated and untreated areas. And this is the timing when most clear differences in disease levels can be seen. You'll also be monitoring for seed and soil-borne diseases, especially if you're considering home saving the seed. And you'll want to look for any whiteheads and diagnose the reason for these. So whether it might be eye spot or take all. So you want to look down into the bottom of the crop, look at the stems and make sure you understand why you're getting the whiteheads. Okay, next slide, please. So what's the best way to properly assess disease levels? So as well as looking in your untreated area, you'll want to look at several different areas in the field, depending on the size of the field. And in each spot, you part the crop in a few areas and look down into the canopy. So we tend to assess percent area infected on the top 4 leaves, but there's lots of different ways of doing this, and different people will do it in different ways. But the most important thing is to always remain consistent with yourself. So with it on one day of assessing and between days, then you can compare your results. But today we'll be using the method used by the recommended list trial operators, which they use to assess the RL trials. Next slide, please. So first, I wanted to go through a bit of disease ID. So although it might seem obvious what disease is what, we do have problems with different diseases getting confused, even with trial operators, because diseases such as Septoria and yellow rust can look so similar. And this is especially so when the yellow rust has died off after a spray, for example. So for this reason, it's important to only assess it as that disease if you're sure that it's that disease. And if you're not sure, then you can assess the percent greenleaf area in the crop instead. So this is Septoria, and it has the characteristic black pycnidia, which are the black dots here. So you should only assess the disease of Septoria if you can see these pycnidia on the leaf. So pick a few leaves and check that what you're seeing is Septoria. Next slide, please. And then this is yellow rust. So we have the characteristic yellow stripes with the pustules on. So you should only assess it as yellow rust if you can see these pustules. Next slide, please. And these are Telia spores, which you get when from yellow rust later in the season. So they're the secondary black spores that appear, and don't confuse them with Septoria pycnidia. They are larger than Septoria pycnidia, so it should be easy to distinguish, but just be aware that you can get these from yellow rust. Next slide, please. And this picture shows how confusing it can be. So you might initially think when looking down into this crop that that is Septoria, but it's actually old yellow rust that has died off at the end of the season. So in this situation, we just do a greenleaf area score. And next slide, please. And the same with this as well. We don't know what the reason for this is. It's probably stress or some environmental factor. So again, we just do a greenleaf area score. Next slide, please. So just to recap, if it has pustules, it's yellow rust. If it has pycnidia, it's Septoria. And if there's just some dead leaf that could be anything, then score green leaf area. And we've produced a YouTube video in collaboration with NIAB, which takes you through how to ID diseases and score when you've got a mix of diseases on the leaf. So do go to YouTube and have a look at that. Next slide, please. So this is the recommended list assessment key that we use. So you've got it in your handout. If you look in your handout, you've got this outline and then what percentage it relates to for each disease. Today we'll just be doing Septoria. So you want to examine the top 4 leaves, ignoring all naturally senescent leaf tissue, and including any chlorosis, so that's yellowing, or necrosis, so that's leaf death attributable to disease. You want to record percent infection, and rather than just recording sort of 5, 10, 15, 20%, you can use values such as 13 or 17, whatever is appropriate for the levels in your crop. And if foci are present, so that's a small area of high infection, then you record the average infection over the area as a whole. Next slide, please. So this is what levels of infection relate to each percent. So I'll just go through it so we're all clear. So 0% infection is obviously no infection. 0.1 is 1 lesion per tiller. 1% is 2 small lesions per tiller. 5% is small lesions beginning to form areas of dead tissue across the width of the leaf. 10%, the 2 lower leaves are large areas of diseased tissue, some covering a third of the leaf. 25% leaves appear half infected, half green. 50% leaves appear more infected than green. 75% very little green leaf tissue left, and 100% leaves are dead with no green tissue left. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a crop you might come across. This is actually an untreated crop, so it's got relatively high disease levels. And if we pick out a few leaves, so if you click on, please, Teresa, we can see this one, it's got no disease, so 0%. Next. And this one I've given about 7%. So Teresa, if you wouldn't mind clicking on, we can look at it a bit bigger. So if we look at our scale that we've got in our handouts, you can see it's not quite got, so if we look at 5%, that's small lesions beginning to form areas of dead tissue across the width of the leaf. So yep, it's probably doing that. Go up to the next scale, 10%, 2 lower leaves, large areas of diseased tissue, some covering a third of the leaf. It's probably not quite that much, so that's why I've given it a 7. And it's not wrong if you give it a 5 or 10, but that's sort of around the place to be. Next slide, please. And then this crop has high levels of disease. If you could click through to the next picture. So that leaf I've given 30%. Next one. That leaf I've given 60%. So if we look at the 30% leaf a bit closer. Thank you. So if we look at our scale, I'm going to look at 25%. So the leaf appears half infected, half green, and that's a bit counterintuitive for 25%, but it's very easy to overestimate the percent disease, which is why that's the scale for 25% disease. And then, so I'd say, yeah, it's definitely at least half infected. So go up to the next scale is 50%. Sorry, back, please, Teresa. 50%, yep, leaves appear more infected than green. Probably not quite that. So I've said between 25 and 50%, I've given it 30%. And then if we look at the next leaf, Teresa. So this one I've given 60%. So if we look at the scale between this, 50% leaves appear more infected than green. Yep, definitely more infected than green there. And 75%, there's very little green leaf tissue left. Well, there's still a bit we can see there along the edge of the leaf. So overall, I've given this 60%. Next picture, please. And then if we look at the crop overall, so taking into account the green top leaves, so looking at the top 4 leaves, I've given an overall disease percent of about 17 to 20% for this crop. So that's when you're going out into the field doing your disease assessing, that's what you want to be roughly giving it. So even though it had high levels of disease on the lower leaves, overall it's much lower. So we're going to do one more example onto the next picture. So one more example before we go into a bit of a quiz and you're going to have a go yourselves. So come into this crop, what do we think? I'm going to start with 5%, small lesions beginning to form areas of dead tissue across the width of the leaf. So yeah, I can see the bottom of the canopy, there's definitely areas of dead tissue. So go up to the next rung on the scale, 10%. The 2 lower leaves, large areas of diseased tissue, some covering a third of the leaf. It's probably not quite that bad. There's not so many. There's a few leaves that meet that criteria, but there's not that many. So I've gone in between 5 and 10, and I've given that crop about 7% overall. Okay, so now it's time for you to have a go. So Teresa, if you click onto the next picture, if you choose from these options along the side, and then polls, once you've had a chance to assess this crop, a poll's going to come up, and you just click the option where you think, and we'll see what your answers are. So Christian, if you could bring the poll up, we'll give you a few moments to look at your handout and your scale and see what you think. Christian, sorry, is it possible to go back to the picture, because we need to look at the picture at the same time as the scale, but hopefully people have had enough time to look at the crop already. If not.
Hi, it's Christian here. Unfortunately, you can't view both at the same time, so it'll have to be a case of we'll spend a bit of time looking at it and then we'll bring the poll up. But for the next for the next two, I'll do that, no problem.
Yeah, sorry about that. So put down what you think. You didn't have much time, but test you a bit. Okay, should we see the results? So we've got the biggest result is 10 to 20%. 38 of people thought it was 10 to 20%. 33% of people thought it was 20 to 30%. 29 thought 30 to 40%, and no one thought it was over 40. So that's pretty good. That's a good range. I said that it was 25%, so anything sort of around that is a good answer. So that's back to the picture now. We can see, yeah, so that's what I gave it. 25% is really, it's quite a susceptible variety, this, and it's untreated, so it's got high levels of disease. So yeah, well done. So the next one now will give you a bit more time looking at the picture and choosing your options. And remember, we're only looking at the top 4 leaf layers. So the leaves at the bottom of the canopy have senesced naturally. So that's why we don't include those ones. Okay, hopefully that's enough time. Should we click onto the poll? So if everyone's selected their answer, if we think that's enough time, then let's see the answers. Okay, so again, a good range in scores. So 35% of people thought it was 0 to 2%, 48% thought 3 to 5, and 13% thought 6 to 7. And I've given this a 1%. So yeah, no one's wrong. It's as long as you're comparable between yourself, then that's good. Okay, so we've got the final test. Got one more to go. Yep, here it is. So got a few ranges of scores there. So have a look at your key, see what you think, and then we'll look at the answers. Okay, is that enough time? Should we bring the poll up? So everyone select their answer, and yeah, we'll see the results. Okay, so seems like we have 5 to 10% as the winner here. 16% thought 0 to 5, 56% thought 5 to 10, 24% thought 10 to 15, and 4% said 15 to 20. And I've given it 8 to 10%. So that's good. Most people are on the right track. That's wonderful. Yeah, so you've sussed it. Okay, well done. So finally, I just wanted to draw your attention to the handout that you've been using with your disease scale on. At the bottom of it is a table that you might want to use when going out to assess your crops. So can print out one for each field, for each timing where you're doing the assessing, record a few details, so when you look back at it, you know what date it was and what growth stage. Do 4 observations in the untreated area, and then choose a few more areas of the field, and how many areas you choose will depend on the size of the field. And part the crop in 4 areas, look down and record your percent disease. You'll probably just have the main diseases there, but if you have any anymore, you can just mention it in the box and then you remember for the future. And then these columns for eye spot, head blight and whiteheads can be used sort of later in the season. So yeah, please do use that. And if you've got any questions, feel free to email me if you're struggling to assess in the field during the season, or if you've got any questions now. Yeah, I haven't looked at any of them in the box yet, so it'll be a surprise for me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Catherine. It's a fantastic run through of a big subject in quite a short time, but hopefully that gave you all an insight into the scoring the process and given you an idea of some of the questions that kind of come up when you're doing it and how to use the scoring sheet. Hopefully you've all managed to open the handout, but the handout that Catherine's done is brilliant and talks you through it. And that video is brilliant as well, isn't it, Catherine? If you want to go back and have a look, and you'll be able to replay this through. So we've got some nice questions that have come through. I've kind of shared them with you as we've gone through to hopefully inspire you as we go through with questions. Please just, if you've got a question, pop it in the questions box and we'll share it and we'll ask it. So to kick us off, Brian, I think if you've got a couple of points you were just going to mention about using phones and technology and how to use data to start us off.
Yeah, so with all this sort of stuff, there's obviously tech that people are trying to develop out there, and there's a few phone apps that say that they can sort of pick out establishment and things like that. And I've sort of done this and used them, and it works only in certain scenarios, but you can't beat actually getting your hands into a crop and actually counting them and actually getting a feel for it. So don't think that phone apps are going to save you lots of time, because actually to get out there and do it in a regimented way, and it's like Catherine said, it's all about your levels and your sort of feel actually out in the field is what sort of gives you the thing. But also you can use technology to help you with all this sort of stuff. So obviously there's satellite NDVI and green area leaf index sort of websites which you can get to, and they're readily available. You can pay for them, so you can use those to sort of go to the areas of the fields as well. So if you go to a really green patch or the lower patch, you can actually use that technology to home your sort of location on the field into a much better way. But also just a single white cane, so you go back to the same spot, is very straightforward. So there's no real savior of high tech, and obviously there are companies that will do more high tech sort of green area leaf index, and there's some really good movements to technology, but it's getting out, getting your boots dirty, going out with your spade, looking at all this sort of stuff through the season is critical. So I would say that sort of don't just think that a phone app's going to tell you, if you take a picture of it, it's going to tell you your green area leaf index. But there are some that do quite a good job if you're bringing them back and taking them in a sort of same lighting sort of light box. They probably would give you very good scoring. So that's the sort of note I was just going to say.
How many points would you typically do in a field, Brian?
It depends on the size of the field, but I sort of, when I'd had my my dog that needed lots of walking, she sort of dragged me around the farm quite a long way. So I would sort of typically I would say I'm going to well, certainly each zone, soil zone, which I've got in the field for variable rate, sort of now looking at variable rate seeding, but I'm probably doing sort of 9 to 10 counts in a sort of 10 hectare, so 1 per hectare. But then if in the 30 hectare field, I ain't going to do 30, but I'm very good at counting to 100 now. So it certainly is. You get quicker, and then you get a feel for the crop that you're looking at, and you can sort of start to pick out assumptions when it's much lower. This season, I've actually found it really quite difficult to do the counts due to erratic establishment. Obviously, this season was one of the hardest establishment seasons, the most drawn out and hardest seasons that we've experienced, certainly in my time. And when I've been doing the counts sort of through the season, I'm expecting that the data is going to be much more, let's say, dirty data, because literally where the wheel of a tractor went, the establishment was much poorer, but then the tillers have compensated in certain scenarios, certain varieties have compensated, but then you go to the coulter right next to it where the wheel wasn't, and that's the population which you're expecting. So there's a real big disparity. So I'm expecting this season's data to be quite dirty, but it's still data that's been taken, and I can use it in future years. So there's questions about sort of establishment and how things go on, and one thing that I would say is go out and make sure you go to the fields which have a plough or a strip till or a direct drill, or if you're trying a new drill, go and do these fields and actually really look at as much detail as you possibly can, because this is what you're then going to base your decisions on in the future. So I found we had a very wet establishment in 2019 for West Farm, and we saw establishment losses of over sort of 45 to 50% in that scenario of being wet with a strip till drill. And so when I had this season, I knew as soon as we got to those conditions that my seed rates had to go up. And so I then used last year's 2 years information or previous information to then make sure that I'm getting the right number of plants for this year. So as soon as we saw the conditions which are going to be wet and the clay was in that sort of horrible plasticine sort of, it wasn't going to have covering up, there's going to be slugs, going to be a problem, I could then adapt my farming sort of right from the start, and I was much more well informed. I could just go, right, I need to up it from 22%, we're straight in at 50 to make sure that I've got enough plants to take through to the winter. So it does change sort of it gives you much more confidence in the decisions that you're doing if you're doing it religiously through seasons, I would say.
And I know Christy Willett's on the call now as well, and I know Christy, we did the crop establishment. We used 7 different drills and 7 different days down on the Chelmsford Monitor Farm, and it was interesting just over that season doing the plant counts at the beginning, but then how that related to yield at the end, and actually that season on season doing the same thing over multiple seasons made a difference. Catherine, given this year that we've had, is it like we haven't seen loads of disease in these kind of years? Or we've got a question here about how does an individual or how do different companies kind of calibrate themselves between a company or between different companies in the, it must be more easy to do in a high disease year in some ways than a low disease year, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we've been I'm responsible for the recommended list disease ratings, and obviously it's important that people are on the same page with disease assessing. So we've been running extra disease assessing training each year for that, and that's why we've produced the videos to help people be on the same page. But agronomy companies will often assess differently. They'll assess by different leaf layers, and that's so they can see, obviously, when you put your fungicides on, you're spraying leaf layers, so it gets you can differentiate the effect from each spray timing on each leaf layer. But that's quite a difficult thing to do, separating the leaf layers when you look down into the crop. It's much easier just to do overall disease percent on the top four leaves. So that's why we do it like that, and it's more relevant for variety trialing as well. But although it's important to be the same as your colleagues, sort of, so all the data is similar, the most important thing is that you're consistent with yourself, because then you can do statistics that sort of normalizes it all, so you can the effect of the person is taken out. So as long as you're consistent with yourself, that's the most important thing, really. So it doesn't matter if you got different answers to those polls, as long as what was higher for you and what was lower for you. So yeah.
Can you envisage, Brian, using some of that disease scoring and having an extra column on your spreadsheet for when you go out using?
Yeah, I think disease scoring for me is the next step. We've done other measurements. There's another question about different measurements, but yeah, I can see that disease scoring is something that certainly now, as we're sort of looking at lowering inputs, looking at obviously loss of actives, there's going to be some really key decisions that are going to be added into our farming sort of assessment sort of portfolio, and I think disease scoring for me is one that I've got to get much better at. So it's really good that we've had this sort of opportunity to sort of look at it, and I think this is where it's going to build on for future years for me. I've also sort of looked at sort of getting other farmers involved. one thing that some people hear us talk about is this Yield Club. So I created a group of local farmers off the back of the Monta Farm group that we had running in the Suffolk, and we've got now 17 farmers who are all doing the same counts on a field on their farm, and we're now using that data and collaborating that data. So it's a great way of getting like-minded farmers together. So I'd sort of recommend sort of benchmarking your crops, not just on your own field, but then also talking to other farmers who have a completely different management system, different soil types, and it sort of gives you that platform to sort of discuss and talk. And our WhatsApp group, our Yield Club WhatsApp group, just goes crazy, and it's a great forum now because we're very open and it's in a closed group. So that's sort of another great thing to do with your next door neighbours. Also, going forward, we're looking at sort of biomass cuts as well. So what we've been doing for the last probably 3 years on this farm is taking full biomass cuts through the season. This gives us being sent off for dry matter analysis. So dry matter is talked about in the growth guide. So is this something that we need to be looking at in more detail in? If you get your dry matter amount for your biomass on the crop, you can then obviously use a much more detailed approach from the growth guide and seeing it through the season. Then if you're doing tissue analysis using the dry matter calculation of tons per hectare, you can then work out how much nutrition is in your crops as well. So you can then start putting accurate figures of nutrition on your crops as well. So that's another sort of side twist that you can do, sort of dry matter calculations, nutrition. You can see what your rate of nitrogen is in your crop, because obviously we know that if you flood your crops with nitrogen, then your disease then explodes because it's feeding on that nitrogen as well. And then this is obviously going to be talked about later on this evening in the lowering input one. So nitrogen levels, and then you start going into all the other details about bricks meters and all this sort of stuff, which gets a bit more detailed. So I know there's plenty of farmers out there trying it and talking about it. So yeah, so there's some fascinating stuff. Also, someone that I just saw flagged up about, do I do it in other different crops? I try and do establishment counts for all my crops, because obviously it's just easy to do when a plant comes up. Beans, very straightforward when you're only counting about 5 up a 50 centimetre run. But the AHDB, this is an old version, do the barley growth guide. So that's just hanging around behind me. So, and then in there they do have benchmarks for barley, both winter and spring. So you can, if your main crop is barley, there's other growth guides out there, but it's very straightforward. Like, there's obviously the yen who do a different calculation, but for me, actually getting out and doing it, that I'm in control of what I'm sort of looking at. You can look at pod set on and branching, root and stem size. So there's loads of stuff you can do, but I would say just start small, build it up, and you'll see the benefits. And I personally think that my cost of production has improved because I'm out there. Okay, it's my time. I'm fortunate that I've got some very competent operators who sort of do all the sort of seat work, but my cost of production and allowing me to do that detailed assessment has made my crop much more cost effective, and my cost of production is lowering because I'm not overspending on fertilizer, I'm not overspending on inputs, adjusting it to the weather conditions. So there's some real worth in going out there. I mean, when people say they don't have enough time, well, during lockdown, we all have plenty of time, and we don't know when we're sort of going to go out and about sort of in the future. So I would say go out and do some plant counts if you're bored.
And similarly, kind of building on that, a question for you, Catherine. For disease scoring wheat, you kind of talked us through. Can you do the same for oilseed rape and barley and other crops, and how might you go about doing that? Yeah,
definitely. So the scale for barley is pretty similar to wheat. I've got similar scales. If anyone wants the barley diseases, I can send that through, that's fine. And we do also have a YouTube video on, it's mainly how to assess ramularia, but you can find that on YouTube as well, so that'll be useful. Oilseed rape's a bit more difficult, but if anyone wants to know how to do that, please get in touch and we can talk through that. But yeah, it's a bit more complicated.
That's brilliant. There's an interesting question here from Christy, Brian, about how does your method compare to kind of yen and some of the other options that are out there. I don't know if you fancy answering that one specifically.
Yeah, yen go into a lot more detail about weather and water and things that I can't really sort of affect and get detailed information about. So what I wanted to do was have a very simple method that I could then hone my skills, and it really started off at seeing how close I could get. And when year 2 and 3 came and I was getting very close to it, I was thinking, well, this is obviously something that's really benefiting me, and I've seen an improvement. But the yen report and the whole yen is a great sort of thing to be involved in, and their report, they come out when they're looking at the analysis of grain and all the nutrition, which they've done over the last couple of years. They give a fantastic report, but my the thing that I like is I can see from my own farm, and I've got that sort of regimented approach, and I can see, and I start looking at different establishments. I can start seeing where, if we place fertilizer, like we've looked at the early biomass with the strategic farm, and early season when we started looking at this, when I actually placed fertilizer, I found that certain varieties actually held more tillers through the season. So I can start breaking all the little trials that I've been doing without the AHDB in the background before the strategic farm. I could actually start seeing that actually when I put a late crop in and the daylight lengths was shorter, soil was colder, actually having fertilizer placed in the root zone actually helped me into the spring, and I actually had a crop that held those tillers and early shoots all the way through. So actually that's where the early biomass manipulation trial came, is that we could actually affect things, but we needed to know more detail. So all the trials that now we're doing here in the east for the strategic farm, ADAS are out doing plant counts, doing shoot counts, ear counts, so we can see if there's any change, because sometimes with statistics, it's not, it all comes down to yield, and if you don't get a proper significant difference, but if there's things that you start noticing, like more shoots, well, if I've got more shoots, should I be applying more fertilizer, or was it the lack of water, or is it just a variety trait? And so having those records is really key for me, just because I'm sort of that sort of, that's how my mind sort of ticks over at night when I've had a few gin and tonics. I'm sort of whirring away, thinking, how can I manipulate my crops and get the most out of it? Should I be putting more fertilizer on? Should I be cutting back? This year we've looked at varying our late last application event, where we saw big variances depending on soil type or drainage. So we've actually gone to variance. So then I've had to say, well, actually, have I held more tillers? Have I lost tillers? Was it this establishment? And so now I've sort of building up that real detailed data set, which then is just setting me in good stead for what's going to be thrown at me in future years.
Brilliant. Talking of detailed data sets, Catherine, do you want to just explain the process of how the recommended list uses the disease scores? Because it all comes through to you, doesn't it, and gets kind of taken forward for the recommended list. I think that might be interesting.
Yeah, so we have trials all over the country for the RL, for the different crops, and we have both untreated trials, so they go alongside the treated trials, which are the data from which goes into the rating, the yield values that you see in the RL. And then we also have dedicated disease trials, and some of these get inoculated with disease. They're inoculated with yellow rust or brown rust, and that's really good quality data that we can rely on in the ratings. So it all comes in early July, and that keeps me busy looking at all the data, sorting through it, deciding what's good and maybe what we can't use, because sometimes, as I was saying earlier, there's a mix of diseases on the leaf and it's difficult to distinguish what disease is what. So dogs learning about disease assessing as well. So yeah, we have to sort of filter through, make sure the data makes sense and are showing what they ought to be showing. Then we collate it all, we do some stats on it. Basically, it's averaging everything, but the data from the inoculated trials has more influence than the naturally infected data, because we can we can rely on it sometimes more than the naturally infected data. So basically it gets averaged over 3 years. So this coming season's rating will use data from 2018, 2019 and 2020. And then this is used to generate the ratings. And we use sort of a scale where we estimate the rating off the amount of disease that variety's got. So yeah, that's a very brief overview.
Yeah. There's a huge amount. It always amazes me just how much goes into, behind the scenes to that recommended list, bringing it all together. And if anybody on the line wants to know more, you're more than happy to talk it through, wouldn't you, Catherine? This is going on, the disease scoring across the country. It's fundamental to the recommended list. And we've included the recommended list in in the handouts on there as well, so you can download it straight from there. Brian, there's some interesting questions here. We've got an audience that are split. David wants to know, is there a way of taking the data and doing less? Ed wants to know what new measurements you're going to do, and Tom wants to know when robotics come out, what that might mean that you can sit back and put your feet up. I just wondered is there, do you think you're doing too much, too less, or are you waiting for the robot to come?
Well, technology is obviously going to come and hopefully make things easier for us. But like the other quote that I use, where the best fertilizer is the farmer's eye. Well, actually, we still got to be out there. We still got to work out what's going to come. So it's really, I think technology is going to help. Obviously, robotics. Obviously, there's different companies out there already looking at sort of field assessments, and the more data that we can gather, the more information, and as it becomes more accurate, then we should be able to look at it. But it all comes at a cost. At the moment, the cost for me is just my time, but any farmer should be out in their fields sort of assessing them anyway. So just having that sort of systematic approach does help. So yeah, I would say it's going to come. Other measurements, obviously disease scoring has been talked about. I use a traffic system for blackgrass pressures and broadleaf weeds. We also use looking at sort of routing by when we dig holes, say, have we got a pan and things like that. So you start noting lots of extra things for each field, and then you're keeping it all in one place. So you're not having lots of pieces of paper diary. You've got one spreadsheet which I can then add columns into and say, look, found cleavers, or found different weeds, pests, slugs, slug trapping, pitfall traps. These are all the things that the strategic farms sort of build into with the IPM idea, the integrated pest management. So if we're putting a slug trap in there and we did it at establishment, and then post winter, we can actually then see what the levels are doing. So it's a great place just to sort of bring yourself back to your farm. And so I do love a spreadsheet, as everyone knows. So it's a great tool to have on your desktop. So that's the sort of thing that we're looking at. And again, more biomass, more nutrition, just building that whole holistical sort of look at our farming system. Can we pull back so we're not using insecticides? I was out last night driving around the farm, and my top of my wheat was shimmering with spider webs. And you're thinking, well, that's just showing the IPM going on. Should I be looking at that in the future? Orange blossom midge is obviously out there at the moment, but I've got plenty of spiders, so I'm not going to be doing anything about the orange blossom midge. So yeah, so it's all these notes are being added all the way through the season, and then at the end of the year, you save a spreadsheet, start a new one up, and then you've got all those records that you can look back on. And which is really key. So I always say, don't farm for what happened last year, but it's great to know what happened last year, because I can sometimes forget what happened yesterday, let alone what's happened a year ago.
Yeah. So talking of this year, and I think just a topical question, possibly the last one to finish, is we've got a couple of questions about kind of historical yields and then kind of marketing going forward. You've already mentioned kind of cross to production, but are you using your kind of yield potential and your calculations, given how close you've got them, to think about, marketing your crop and looking at your cost of production going forward?
Yeah, so using the cost production, obviously, we've been doing the AHDB benchmarking for a number of years now through Monitor Farm and Strategic Farms. That's a great tool that farmers can use and use it to budget cost of production as well. So we've been using that. We're looking at marketing. We obviously don't want to over market, but we wouldn't be taking it to that sort of level. Obviously, our aim is to sort of do pretty much a third before or a quarter before the actual combine's gone in. You can't base all decisions on a number of counts, but it certainly gives you a feel of where you should be. Also knowing how much a certain variety, so if you're growing a group 1 or a group 2, you can make really quite good estimates on how much you're going to have in store. And so then if you get a good deal and you think, actually I can make money at 170 or 100 or 100 pounds a ton, depending on what season or what crop the marketing scenario is, you can then use that as a bit more of a, actually I've got that in store, or potentially got this in store, and then so your marketing doesn't become a slightly different before the actual combines roll. So you could actually say, well, actually we'll just, estimated yield is 10 tons, we're going to do half before combines roll, so we know that where we are, and then we've got half to go afterwards, and you can adjust it for the season. So like this season, I think I'll be shaking your hand off if someone said that I was going to have an 8.5 ton average across my farm. I've got some good bits and I've got some bad bits, but some fields are still saying that they might do 10 ton. Well, if I get 10 ton this year, I'll be pretty well over the moon with it. And then I've got some fields which I reckon will probably do 5. So it's going to be a really interesting season going forward, and we just don't know what is actually going to come in with weather-wise, and weather is the biggest affector of yield. And we've seen it again and again. The rain at the right time, grain fill last year saved us, and hopefully we'll get some rain in the next sort of 10 days that will do the same again and really will bolster up the yields. Because actually for us on our farm, I'm surprised at how well our crops are actually holding on. They've held, okay, we've lost some of the smaller tillers, but the main tillers and the size of the ears that have come out of the main tillers, hopefully we should have something to get in the combine tank and market it in future months.
Brilliant. And just to kind of finish, Catherine, a final word. You're seeing the same on your recommended list trials as everybody's seeing the same across the country, and that will all be taken into account as you assess those through the summer.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not getting a chance to go out and see many crops at the moment, but I know that our trial operators will be assessing everything, yeah, as it goes on. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both of you. Andrew is very keen that you'll want to know whether your dog comes out measuring fields and assessing it with you. I say Ruby is a key companion in Brian's plant counting world.
Yeah, Ruby does come out. So yeah, she kept coming up to me and sort of nudging me, saying, "Come on, you need to go for a walk." So I was just looking at the time, thinking, well, actually, we've been on here probably long enough. So it's nice to round it up. Yeah, Ruby is a key part of the strategic farm mascot. So we're always nice to see Ruby pop up.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Brian and Catherine. So just to kind of round up this morning's session, your 5 handouts are on the link. Hopefully you've all found where they are and been able to download the ones you want. We'll make sure the resources are all shared alongside the recording of this webinar. So the main resources you've got is kind of how to measure plant populations. So it's something that we pulled together based on Brian's work and his kind of thinking and the week growth guide, so you can use that in the autumn, and then that can follow through for your ears and tillers and shoots. We've got a disease scoring record sheet that Catherine's put together that you've seen. We've got the disease scoring video that Catherine mentioned earlier as well, and that kind of takes you through it, a really useful resource. Don't forget we've got the growth guides, the wheat, barley, oilseed rape ones. There's an oat one that PepsiCo have done, the recommended list, and then the fungicide management guide as well. So lots of resources there for you to use. All can be downloaded, and we'll make sure the links go up along with the recording. So just to kind of finish off, Strategic Farm Week is going on for the rest of this week. We've got the videos on all the Strategic Farm trials that were released yesterday, that are linked on the main SF Week 2020 website. We've got Brian and our ADAS researchers talking through where we've got to with each of the trials, so you can get an insight for them before harvest and before our results days in the autumn. We've got 2 more webinars happening today, one at 12 o'clock looking at monitoring pests and natural enemies, days in field, and then, as Brian's mentioned, one tonight looking at how to lower inputs with Simon Cowell and Tim Parton, that the Strategic Farm Scotland are leading on. We've got a podcast special coming out tomorrow. Paul Temple, the chair of our Cereals and Oilseeds board, has interviewed Brian, Rob and David, our 3 strategic farmers, about what it's like to be a strategic farm. You can download that tomorrow and have a look at the handouts that have got all the kind of graphs, the costings, the information related to the strategic farms as well. Thursday, we've got 3 more webinars, one on crop establishment and considerations for that, one on soil structure, best assessments and earthworms, and then in the evening at 7 o'clock, we've got a mould drainage session with Philip Wright, Brian and David Lord and Harry Henderson. And then on Friday, we'll be sharing all the way through the day our how-to resources that we've had and we've been sharing all the way through the week, so that hopefully you can go home or go back, you are home, go back outside and through the year, through the next year, kind of use some of these and test it out on farm. As Brian said, there's nothing like doing it yourself. So do get involved, take part. That's SF Week 2020 website, everything's on, and we'll keep that updated as we go through the week. Just to kind of say, if you've enjoyed today, thank you for joining us. It's been great to see you all. And we have got our regional monitor farm webinars through the country. So instead of our summer meetings that we normally have, we're going to have a webinar. You should have got an email about those. But that's the recommended list ones that Catherine talked about, and our Cereals and Oilseeds monthly one. You can register, and all the details are on our events page. So it's just from Catherine and from Brian and from me. I feel like I'm on a TV show. It's time to kind of round up this morning. You will, at the end of this webinar, get a survey that pops up. It'd be really useful if you would just take 2 minutes to fill it in, to find out, what you found interesting or not. It's the first time that we're doing webinars quite a lot anyway, but it's the first time we're doing it in this way. So if you've got any ideas or thoughts or want to see anything else in this form, please let us know. The webinar has been recorded and that will be available. We'll upload that onto YouTube. So if you want to go back and listen in again, or look at Brian's spreadsheet, under copyright, Brian, you can do that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop me an email, teresa.meadows@ahdb.org.uk. I notice a few more have been putting their basis forms in. If you've missed putting your basis number in, please just let me know, drop me an email, and do stay in touch through the week. #strategicfarm for those of you on Twitter, and that's all of our Twitter handles there as well. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a great morning. Thank you very much, Brian and Catherine. Absolutely fascinating talk through, and I look forward to hearing lots of chat about people assessing their crops through the year, disease scoring, and using that to make a difference going forwards. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.